Okay, so second last lecture, environmental issues in Trinidad and Tobago, the biota and its conservation. This is a lecture which was originally put together by Dr. Howard Nelson and also added to by Dr. Luke Rostan. And I'm carrying on the great tradition here and presenting the lecture myself with some of my interpretations and experience as well. So we'll take a look at what Trinidad and Tobago has, the diversity of Trinidad and Tobago. We'll take a look at the people and the socio-economic scenario of Trinidad and Tobago, some of the impacts on the biodiversity, and finally how that biodiversity, or nature as it is called here, has been managed. So first of all, the biodiversity. So this picture is probably up in the Arima Valley. This is an ornate hawk eagle, which is a magnificent bird, bird of prey. It preys on fairly large mammals, usually up in the trees and so on. So this is a top order predator, which quite often hangs around at the top of the Arima Valley, and they can see it at Asa Right. So Trinidad, it has biodiversity. Yes, it does have biodiversity. It has quite a lot of biodiversity, actually, because it is in fact a tropical island, and you can see Trinidad right there. Trinidad is 4,800 square kilometers, Tobago 300 square kilometers. Together they add up to about 5,000 square kilometers. Just off the coast of South America. It's in a tropical, moist tropical area of the world, so it tends to have fairly large biodiversity. But it's also a continental island, so it was connected to the South American mainland during the last ice age, or as recently as maybe 11,000 years ago, although I think this reference actually speculates that maybe Trinidad was actually connected to the mainland through the Caucasus Peninsula, maybe even as late as 2,000 or 3,000 years ago, judging by the changes in the deepwater corals in the Gulf of Paria. But I mean, that hasn't been proved one way or the other. The fact that Trinidad is a continental island has enormous implications for the biodiversity, particularly with respect to species richness and endemism. Species richness in Trinidad and Tobago is almost as high as that of the mainland continent of South America. In other words, it's very high. It's the highest of all the English-speaking Caribbean islands, but of course not as high as Guyana, which is actually on the mainland. The endemism of Trinidad, because it was joined to the continent so recently, it has not had time to develop its own species, which are found in Trinidad and nowhere else. And in fact, there's only a few species which are known to be endemic to Trinidad. There's about, I think we calculated about 52 species of plants, and since then, that was about 2008, since then a good maybe 3 or 4 of them have been shown to not be endemic. They've been found elsewhere, or they've had taxonomic revisions, so they're no longer endemic. In the background here you can see one of the 2 endemic birds in Trinidad. This is the powie. It's a turkey-sized bird which occurs in the northern range, particularly at the eastern edge of the northern range, where clearing for agriculture has not denuded most of the slopes of natural vegetation. The other endemic bird is a motmot. Motmot's a crow-sized bird which eats snakes and so on. Fills the niche, similar sort of niche as a kookaburra in Australia, but it doesn't laugh as well. so only 2 endemic birds. It is very species rich, up to 420 species of birds, over 2,500 I believe species of flowering plants. If you compare that with some of the other islands in the Caribbean, not really of similar size, but per unit area this species richness is much higher than any of the other English-speaking Caribbean islands. However, endemism in the other English-speaking Caribbean islands tends to be much higher. Those islands have been isolated longer, so they've had a greater period of time to develop their new and unique species. So there you go, Trinidad, high species richness, low endemism. So that's the situation before we add people in. So avian species richness of approximately 420 species, including this yellowtail or cornbird, which is a rather nice addition to the bird community. Mammal species richness of about 97 native species. Most of them are going to be these rat-like things, but also bats as well. And also 16 distinct terrestrial communities. So we would have different types of rainforest, including lowland rainforest, evergreen seasonal rainforest, semi-deciduous rainforest, deciduous rainforest. We would also have lower montane and elfin woodlands. We would also have savannas and littoral vegetation communities, all in a relatively small, compact area, and that mainly is the result of the fact that Trinidad is an island, and it does have a lot of edge effects causing quite a few distinctive communities, but it's also reflective of the fact that we have the northern range, which gives some altitude and allows distinct terrestrial communities, and also because we're on the eastern side of the continent and we have a very strong rainfall gradient going from east to west. It's high rainfall in the east, low rainfall in the west, and that means we can have deciduous communities in the west and evergreen rainforest communities in the east. The marine and intertidal communities are also very diverse. We would have the mangroves, of course, coral reefs, intertidal mudflats and beaches. We would also have seagrass meadows and sandy and soft bottom ecosystems or habitats. But there are also aquatic freshwater habitats. Some of them, well, it's certainly not to the same extent that you would get in continental regions, because unfortunately Trinidad, being an island, doesn't really have a huge amount of rivers to go with. As Dr. Starr would say, that's not a river, that's a creek. Well, that's what they would say in Guyana. The aquatic freshwater habitats are divided by the northern range. On the north side there tends to be a distinct fish fauna compared to the south side, indicating that colonization of the freshwater habitats by the continental fauna has only gone as far as the watersheds of the northern range, and on the northern side there is a much more Caribbean type aquatic fauna. Similarly, we would tend to find compositions of the flowering plants or distributions of species of flowering plants somewhat influenced by historical biogeographical patterns. For instance, you don't find the Pentaclethra macroloba, the fine leaf tree, up in the northern range. It only penetrated inland along some of the valleys on the southern side of the northern range, but it doesn't get into the northern range itself. Other trees like the cannonball tree, we've got one of those on campus, seems only to occur south of the Central Range, and the individuals which occur north of the Central Range seem to have been planted there. So there are historical factors controlling the composition of the plant communities in Trinidad and Tobago. But overall, a very diverse ecosystem because of all those gradients, because of the tropical situation, and because it is an island. So, on to the people and the socioeconomics. Here is a scene where land is being reclaimed from the sea. Spoil is dumped into the ocean and the land inches outwards, increasing the land area but destroying littoral and marine habitats. In Trinidad we have a very diverse ethnic human community, about 40% East Indian, 40% African origin, about 18% mixed, and maybe 2% of other ethnic backgrounds. And this has an implication in that different communities will use biodiversity in different ways, so that the biodiversity is much more likely to be comprehensively used in Trinidad compared to other parts of the world where ethnic groups are less diverse. I should have a slide here on agriculture, but let's talk about industry first of all. Industry is very big in Trinidad, less so in Tobago. It's big in Trinidad because of the presence of oil. Oil has allowed a fairly large-scale industrial economy to develop, mainly because of the refining and development of petroleum and petroleum products, but also with the cheapness of energy, other industries have been allowed to develop. With this becomes higher wages, which draws people from other sectors of the economy, and in particular agriculture, and draws them into the industrial economy. Now this lack of agriculture, or this lack of concentration on agriculture, has meant that Trinidad has managed to keep, and Tobago has managed to keep a far larger percentage of its land area under natural forest than any of the other English-speaking Caribbean islands. Approximately 30% of the island was or has been reserved in forest reserves, so that the land use is dedicated towards providing resources which forests provide, and therefore they are not likely to be cleared. So Trinidad, these lands are also protected. They won't be cleared for agriculture, and that is or has not been put under too much pressure in the past, because there hasn't been a large group of people with nothing to do, going hungry, and therefore looking for land to farm so that they can survive. Instead, people will find high-paying jobs in the industrial sector, and so they don't have that desire to go and clear land for agriculture. So agriculture, it tends to be fairly low-key in Trinidad, has a minor role, a much more minor role to play in the economy of Trinidad compared to other islands in the Caribbean, and as a consequence natural ecosystems are under much less pressure. But also because of the industrial development, the density of people in Trinidad and Tobago tends to be one of the highest in the Caribbean and indeed in the Western Hemisphere. So there is a density of 251 persons per square kilometre. I think that's really only topped by Barbados in the region. There's 1.3 million people. The density of people, as you know, can have a big impact on what happens to the biodiversity. Generally, more people, more endangerment of plants and animals. However, counterbalancing that is the per capita income in Trinidad and Tobago. It is one of the highest in the Caribbean, within the top 5. So that is because of the oil revenue, and that means, and the economy which has grown up around that, and that means that biodiversity in Trinidad survives to this day. Trinidad and Tobago are one of the most technologically developed countries in the region, and this technology is quite often freely used in nature, okay, for timber harvesting, for clearing, unfortunately, and other things. The little equation down the bottom there is one index of impact of humans on the natural environment, and impact would equal the population, or the density of people, multiplied by the per capita income, the affluence of the society, again multiplied by technology, how much access to technology people have. Do they have bulldozers, or are they restricted to chainsaws and axes? These 3 factors, population density, affluence and technology, will influence the impact that people have on their natural environment. And for all 3, Trinidad ranks fairly highly in the region, and particularly within the Caribbean. So the scene is set for a fairly large impact of people on the biodiversity of Trinidad and Tobago. And here we have a scene in the background here. This is a typical oil road that you see into these oil producing areas, a road which is developed to go to the wellhead, and you can see a donkey there pumping oil. You can see spilled oil here, creating a pollution hotspot, which looks like it has been some attempt to contain it. Less obvious, you can see around here all of this feathery, fluffy looking vegetation is all bamboo, and that's non-native, and secondary degraded vegetation, which probably has come in after all of this area has been disturbed by maybe fire, probably. This is more natural forest that you're seeing up here, but this is a heavily impacted and disturbed landscape in this particular picture, disturbed not only by technological advances and the extraction of oil, but also through degradation, probably from humans burning and so on. And that's not unusual from around the world. As you all know, the next big extinction crisis is here. Trinidad is not really missing out on that extinction crisis. We still have large areas of forest, and a few of our species are in danger of being disappeared, and I want to take a look at some of the reasons why in Trinidad extinction may be haunting a few species in the next few years. You all know about the ultimate threats and the proximate threats to biodiversity. The ultimate threats here in Trinidad are overhunting, habitat destruction, exotic species, less so, exotic species, ecosystem stress or pollution. And these are general categories of anthropogenic impacts on natural ecosystems and therefore threats to biodiversity. Now, Dr. Nelson finds that overexploitation is one of the main reasons why native species are being driven to extinction or to very low population levels. And here we've got three different species which are being heavily utilized. Marine turtles, chip from the intertidal zone, and sharks offshore. Sharks are globally endangered. Chips can also be over-harvested and may in the future become harder and harder to find and may be extinct. Marine turtles are undergoing somewhat of a renaissance. Well, certainly the leatherbacks, but the shelled turtles, like I think this is a loggerhead, are still very much in trouble in the Caribbean. Overexploitation is the reason why all of these species are looking to be severely reduced in number, if not made extinct in the future. Game animals are very heavily hunted in Trinidad and Tobago. It is a practice which has gone on in Trinidad and Tobago for hundreds of years. The Amerindians also hunted back for 5,000 years or so, and there isn't any evidence that they actually drove any animals to extinction in Trinidad and Tobago or even decreased the population densities. There is evidence in places like Puerto Rico and many of the smaller islands that mammals were driven to extinction. But here in Trinidad there was no archaeological evidence which showed the Amerindians had any great impact on populations of mammals. There was certainly no decrease in their presence in the middens or the garbage dumps which archaeologists like digging through to find out how people lived. All through the colonial period, hunting was carried out quite extensively. The area of forest maybe 100 years ago was probably much smaller than it is today. So during the past 100 years or so, with the decline of agriculture, secondary forest has increased in size, increasing the habitat for a lot of these game animals. So in theory, the population of these game animals should have increased. What has changed now? Within the past 10 years or so, there has been an increase in perception of the increase in the number of animals taken, and the data seems to show a decline in the number of animals which have been taken per unit hunting effort. So is this the sign that the game animal populations has been declining? By game animal populations we mean a lot of the large mammals, particularly things like the red brocket deer, the wild hog or quenk, the red-rumped agouti, really see the red rump there, and the lap. Also we have the nine-banded armadillo or tattoo, also hunted. So these animals have been hunted by humans for thousands of years. There have been indications that the populations of these animals however, in recent years has been cut drastically, and it's probably through overhunting. So this is data which was compiled by Dr. Nelson and Professor Stan Temple from the United States, where they looked at the agouti catch per hunting effort, which was proportional to the number of licenses sold for hunting agouti. And as you can see, over the course of the years from 2000 to 2006, the number of agoutis caught has declined almost with a fairly strong relationship some up until 2005. So this is a signal that the population of agouti is declining, making them harder to find by their hunters. And there are similar trends in the other animal or game species. So we can take this to indicate that populations of game animals are indeed being overexploited and on a downward trend. Now, the government is obviously quite worried about this, and they have instituted a game animal survey using more up-to-date techniques such as camera trapping, but also traditional techniques such as walking along line transects and estimating the number of animals from sightings and finding of trace of those animals, like spore prints and feces of different game animals. So this work has been done, and it has shown that of the game animals, the majority of them occur at much lower densities than you would tend to find in more pristine or areas of neotropical forests which occur at on the continent of South America. So for instance, the agouti occurs at a mean density of about 56 animals per square kilometre in South America on average. In Trinidad, it occurs at 8 animals per square kilometre, according to the surveys carried out by the wildlife section and Dr. Nelson. Red howler monkeys tend to occur at a higher density. Red brocket deers, about half the density that you would expect. Lap, an even lower density. Tattoo, or the armadillo, even lower. Wild hog, about a third of the density you would expect. Porcupine, this is probably a misnomer, because something like porcupine is difficult to see, and so you're probably less likely to see it using the transect method, which this data is gathered from. Squirrels, also much lower density. Tyras, however, tend to come in at a higher density. So the numbers of game animals in Trinidad look to be much lower than they should be. It's not just game animals, but we also have the other species, in particular conch, these are ocean conch or queen conch, which you would get in the ocean off Tobago, but you would also find the snail conch in the freshwater habitats. Recently I have heard that cascadoo was very severely overfished in freshwater habitats, so much so that they actually brought in cascadoo from Guyana to try and restock the drains and rivers of Trinidad with cascadoo. So that's an indication of exploitation or over-exploitation of these animals which are being exploited for food. So these are another set of data comparing densities of agouti. As you can see, the Central Range Wildlife Sanctuary comes in at a much lower density than the majority of other parts of the neotropics. Barrow Colorado Island is probably very much a misnomer, because it's an island where all the large predators have been removed, so agoutis are probably at a much higher level than they should be. But some of these other levels, well, these are quite equivalent, but over in Venezuela you would find 6 times as many agouti in the habitat than you would in Trinidad forests. Overexploitation. Other animals which have been overexploited are the native finches, or the native seed-eating birds. These are captured and used by cage bird admirers, and they are actually put to sing against each other as a form of betting and so on. So these native finches can go for very large prices, up to $10,000 or even more per bird, for a bird which is particularly talented with its length of singing and the complexity of its notes. It will fetch a large amount of money, because it will win all of these sing-off contests, and then all the bets which go along with that. So overexploitation is definitely present in Trinidad. It is likely that it is impacting on several species. Or I should mention also the powie. The powie is a turkey-sized or chicken-sized bird, which obviously would be very tasty to hunters. And so its current status is very restricted, and we don't know how many birds still exist. It's probably around about 60 or so, restricted to the northeast of the island, in the forested areas of the northern range. It is probably reached that situation through overhunting. Alright, habitat loss and fragmentation is also a problem in Trinidad, but as I mentioned earlier, less of a problem in Trinidad than, say, compared to some of the other islands in the Caribbean. The peak of habitat loss and fragmentation in Trinidad was probably in the early part of the 20th century, when large areas of native forests were cleared and planted up with cocoa plantation. Since World War II, however, there has been a regrowth of forest habitat, as agriculture has been abandoned in many areas. This picture shows areas of forested native ecosystems, or forested ecosystems, high diversity forested ecosystems. Actually, it doesn't even show that. And it looks like more than a third of the island is actually covered in forest, more like about a half. But this is actually a misnomer, because I know that many of these forests, particularly in the western half of the northern range, much of the central range, and large areas down here in the southwest, all of those forests are either secondary recovering cocoa plantations. Much of the north coast was estates, cleared estates, up until maybe 100 years ago, and it now recovered to secondary forest. Same with the central range, in the central part of Trinidad, and down here in the southwest, many of these trees are actually coconut palm plantations. So the core areas here in the southeast, here in the eastern half of the northern range, And in this area in central, and look, there's the arena forest there, these areas are protected as forest reserves. As I mentioned, forest reserves cover about a third of the island, 33% of the island, and they preserve natural ecosystems with high biodiversity. But those forest areas, even though they are quite impressive, are also under threat. Here's our picture once again showing oil production within one of these forest reserves and the negative impacts on biodiversity which can go with that use of a forested area. Apart from this oil extraction, there is also problems with spontaneous agriculture or squatting, which clear areas of forest and more importantly introduce sources of fire and ignition into forested areas. And these are some of the main dangers to natural ecosystems today, along with things like resource extraction in the form of quarrying for gravel and sand. Gravel and sand mining has cleared more native habitat and advanced secondary forest in Trinidad in the past 10 years than has occurred probably in the past 100 years. So reversing a lot of those gains which were made after agriculture declined after World War II. Okay, introduced species. Trinidad and Tobago has had fewer challenges with introduced species, but it is still an island and there still can be introductions of introduced species which may have impacts on the rest of the biodiversity. This is an example which Dr. Nelson has put in. The blue gourami is the latest aquatic invasive species. We would also have tilapia as well, colonizing and disrupting native fish populations. On land and in terms of plants, if we go back to this picture of degradation, these, as I said before, these fluffy type crowns all belong to bamboo. Bamboo is not a native species, it comes from Southeast Asia, but it will colonize degraded areas, particularly fire-prone areas, and because it can survive fire better than the native species, it can colonize areas which are frequently disturbed. And in promoting fire by drying out at a quicker rate than a native forest, it will tend to promote itself, particularly if there are sources of ignition which humans almost inevitably provide. Climate change is going to have an impact in Trinidad. We don't know exactly how at the moment because that is going to be reliant on the changes in the rainfall patterns, both spatially and temporally or seasonally. It is likely that rainfall will change in amount and seasonality. If it does so, we may see a shift in our communities from more evergreen communities to maybe more deciduous communities. Also, with climate change, there is a risk that the cloud bases will rise, and this will cause a decrease in cloud forest vegetation at the tops of the northern range. So what you say, of the plant species, about 25 to 30 or 40% of the endemic plant species were found in these cloud forest habitats at the top of the northern range. So if we lose those cloud forests, we're going to lose those endemic species and the extinction which will result. So it could be that we will find a reduction in the number of species because of climate change. So, what have people done to manage biodiversity in Trinidad and Tobago? So this is actually looks like a cloud forest. You can see the clouds moving between the trees in a very cold and spooky sort of way. Well, there are institutions which are tasked or mandated with the conservation of biodiversity. We have the Environmental Management Authority, the Forestry Division, the Ministry of Agriculture, the Ministry of Housing and the Environment, would you believe, and the Ministry of Planning and the Economy. These ministries have changed since this lecture was prepared. Of course, it's the Ministry of Environment and Water Resources now, but you still have Ministries of Agriculture and Ministry of Planning. Forestry Division is part of the Ministry of the Environment, as is the Environmental Management Authority. So we have governmental organizations which want to preserve biodiversity. The Forestry Division was pretty much created to administer all of those large forest reserves which were established in the early part of the 20th century. The Environmental Management Authority was really established to minimize pollution and deforestation and degradation of land in Trinidad. Right, so challenges of the future. It's amazing to think that Trinidad is practically the only country in the Western Hemisphere which does not have any national parks. It's not that Trinidad has not tried to establish national parks. There have been 3, if not 4, attempts to establish a national park network in Trinidad. Now, the reason why I'm focusing on national parks is because national parks are focused on preserving biodiversity. We do have extensive protected areas in Trinidad in the form of forest reserves, but their main goal may not necessarily be protecting biodiversity. And in most cases, those forest reserves are expected to produce a product rather than preserve biodiversity. So what happened to all of these protected moves to try and establish a protected area network? First was from around 1972. It was designed and planned, but not in the end, not implemented. In 1980, the Organization of American States, disgusted that Trinidad was the only country without national parks, funded the development of a national park systems plan. Again, not implemented, not ratified by the government, so it's there on paper, and we have the prohibited areas of the Aripo Savannas and Bush Wildlife Sanctuary and Trinity Hills, which are based on this system plan, but actually have no legal status. The World Bank provided financial support for a national parks project in the second half of the 1990s, but that project was abandoned in 2000. And the EMA tried to unilaterally go forward with a establishment of a system of protected natural areas and began to establish the environmentally sensitive areas network. The Matura environmentally sensitive area was first established, followed by Aripo, Nariva, and I believe Buku Reef have all been established as environmentally sensitive areas, with the idea that in the future these may form the core of a national parks network. So why haven't we established a system of protected areas in Trinidad? It's really because the people are not pressuring the government to do so. The government will be loath to lock up resources for one use, which would be the preservation of biodiversity, and they would prefer to leave these forests open for other uses, in particular timber extraction and maybe mining and oil extraction, so that they can keep their options open for the future in maximizing return from these natural resources. It really has to be up to the population, and with the growth of a middle class, we could find in the future that protected natural areas will be established. So there remains no legally constituted national park system in Trinidad and Tobago, despite the fact that 75% of people support the creation of a national park system. I think one of the reasons why government has not seen fit to do it is because they do not see any sort of economic rationale for doing it. In other parts of the insular Caribbean, particularly the English-speaking Caribbean, national parks have been seen as wonderful marketing tools for tourism. If you have a national park, people are much more likely to visit your country because they feel reasonably assured that they are going to a place where they will be able to see natural rainforest and so on. If there's no national parks, people are less likely to come because they are not so sure that they are going to see the best natural ecosystem or pristine ecosystems in a country. So the challenge then is trying to convince governments and other land managers to establish a protected area network. So what do we need to do? Well, developing a protected area network would probably be one of the most important things which could be done. Reduction of habitat loss is probably also very important. The northern range and the area around Valencia tends to be a focus of habitat loss at the moment. Coastal ecosystems are also tend to be targeted for development. This is not just in Trinidad but also in the other islands of the Caribbean. Oceanside land tends to be preferentially developed because everybody wants to live by an ocean. So habitat loss in littoral woodlands means that very little littoral woodlands remains in Trinidad. Wetlands are also problematic as well because they are seen to contain mosquitoes and be very unproductive. The development of legislation which takes into account changing socioeconomic conditions in Trinidad also needs to happen. So updating laws and legislation on use of natural resources to take into account that a lot of timber has been harvested from the forests, and people will tend to use those forests in different ways today. So much so that timber production is probably not the priority from the native forested habitats in Trinidad today. Instead, the priority would be hunting, hiking, and bird watching, and ecotourism. So we need to update our legislation to reflect that, and so that the objectives of the management of that land as directed by legislation will have these new goals in mind. Pollution is a big problem in Trinidad, particularly in aquatic and near-shore marine environments. Trinidad, with its technological progress, has also brought with it lots of pollution and so on. So Trinidad is one of the most polluting countries in the region because of its industrialization. Addressing this pollution is something which needs to be done urgently in Trinidad. We've already lost much of our seagrass meadows and the animals which depend upon them. More than 2/3 of the country is already heavily degraded. A lot of it is actually colonized by people with urban and rural agricultural environments, and so the remaining third needs to be protected. And so there needs to be a reduction of further habitat loss and so on, and a development of a comprehensive wildlife conservation scheme. So what are some of the things going forward which may help conservation in Trinidad and Tobago? There is a National Green Fund, a large pool of money which can be used for conservation projects and saving biodiversity. There are several conservation groups working on the endangered Trinidad piping guan. Marine turtle conservation is very much a success story, where there has been successful links between the protection of turtles and income for local peoples, so that they are motivated then to protect their turtles in much the same way that Dr. Rostand talked about local people's use of resources. There needs to be new policies which reflect the updated use of natural resources in Trinidad and Tobago. And there needs to be reform of the agencies which were set up to administer these policies and laws which affect the conservation of biodiversity. And there you go. From one scientist to a bat, thank you very much. So that is the lecture on environmental issues in Trinidad and Tobago.